Welcome to day 3. I have to add into that I miss being together, but the conference content has been really good. Day 2 continued the message and great sharing. It's really nice to have political leadership with such strong experiences and commitment to children and families and making public schools better places for all kids. From Secretary Cardona's opening remarks to yesterday's chat with Cindy and Katie, we heard strong messages of building back better. On a personal note, many of you know I'm a fairly new grandparent. Right before the pandemic, we moved 3 blocks from our grandson, so I was in his bubble. Hanging out with Logan sure helped during the worst of the pandemic. And it was also nice seeing Logan's mom, my daughter. So I don't have any Metro stories to tell, as I haven't been on Metro since March 13th, 2020. But I do have a transportation story. Last weekend, I was driving to New England, and at the Connecticut border on 95, there was a signboard indicating a 37-mile backup. That would be my definition of purgatory. Our GPS asked if we wanted to be rerouted, and we said yeah. It took us off the next exit, had us make a left, a right, and then we were getting right back onto 95, about 0.2 of a mile further north. So just as we were getting on the ramp, a tow truck cut us off and drove another car off the road. We got back on 95, and a half a mile later, there was the tow truck, which had rear-ended a nice new large SUV in the middle lane. The tow truck driver threw open his door and jumped down on the road. He looked really big, extremely muscular, and was clearly angry and was heading for the SUV, where I'm sure he assumed a guy like me would likely get out. Instead, the SUV door, now understand, I'm in the middle of 95. The SUV door opened and out stepped a huge man, ZZ top beard, overalls, and his fists were bald. The tow truck driver was completely stunned. So I guess it's the old don't judge a book by its cover parable. Yesterday you heard from Greg from the MSIP side, and today I'm going to talk a bit about the research to practice side of the House. We partner with Greg's shop to assist states in the effort to improve outcomes for children with disabilities and their families. But we also work through training, state improvement, technical assistance, technology, data, and parent centers to push the envelope of what is possible for children with disabilities and their families. Greg and I have worked together for nearly 30 years. In our youth, we used to go running every day at lunch. And not to date ourselves, but on one run, we ran into President Clinton, who was also out for a run. He was going at a good pace, and we ran with him for 10 minutes. We actually discussed disability with him, and he asked us what we thought about a couple of issues. Well, since then, Greg and I have considered ourselves to be presidential advisors. I tell that story to emphasize that Greg and I have always worked together. Our divisions support each other's work. The Part D side of the House supports the Part B, Part C, and 619 side to support children with disabilities. I have enjoyed the sessions thus far, but definitely miss seeing you all in person. Many thanks to the conference planning team, both our internal OSEP team members and our external partners. Special thanks to Renee Bradley and Diana Hugh and Darcel and Darling for leading the conference planning effort. I also want to thank the staff of the RTP division. 16 months of working from home, and they have not missed a beat. They are absolutely terrific. It's been a long 16 months. I, like everyone else, have been working from home, dealing with technology challenges, welcoming the children of staff as our new work colleagues, and getting to know the pets of our colleagues, and learning a new definition of business casual. Today, I'm going to spend my 20 minutes, which is generally for me code for 25, on talking about the Part D discretionary programs and the historical and critical role they continue to have in improving outcomes for children, teachers, related services providers, administrators, early childhood providers, families, and communities. What's the purpose of Part D? Well, there were 12 specific congressional findings in IDEA and a number of sub-findings. But the overarching purpose of Part D is to assist states in their efforts to improve opportunities and outcomes for children with disabilities and their families. I want to emphasize that Part D and B and C work symbiotically to improve outcomes for children with disabilities. However, and I cannot emphasize this enough, another critical purpose of our program is innovation, to continue to push the envelope of what is possible for children with disabilities and their families. We have been supporting innovation through a variety of technology investments, such as the use of social robots, doctoral training through a consortia approach, where scholars have cross-faculty and cross-university experiences. They leave their programs with a large network of collaborators already in place. We've supported innovative instructional approaches through our Progress TA centers. We've supported new data approaches through our Center to Integrate IDEA Data, CID. CID was stimulated 8 years ago when I was asked the question, how many students with disabilities were also Title I eligible? The answer I received from the department's data warehouse was 22 million. And given that there were only 6 million students with disabilities at the time, we knew we had to do something to improve those data. The CID developed Generate software tool has allowed states to not only submit higher quality data, but gives them the ability to cross-tabulate their data for the first time. Crosstabs such as how many kids with autism in a given state are also Title I eligible and are homeless. That kind of data can drive change. Our SPDGs are focusing on professional development systems change. We have funded model demonstration projects that focus on coaching and Part C screening and identification and a host of other investments. We have tried through our investments to drive the field through innovation. So let's take a look at the administration's proposed Part D budget. Please remember that this is only a proposed budget, but at the minimum, it signals the new administration's priorities. And I think you will all agree with me that they are welcome priorities. While the SPDG, Technology, and Special Olympics received no proposed increases, the Parent Center program received a proposed $2.7 million in additional funds, which represented a 9% increase. The TA&D program received a proposed $5 million increase, representing a 10% increase. And the personnel preparation program received an increase of $160 million, representing a 64% increase. Very welcome news indeed. Just to put it in perspective, if a typical doctoral training or master's level training grant is $250,000 a year, you can do the math and see what a $160 million increase could potentially represent. So I'd like to focus my remaining comments around three core principles important to all our efforts. And you can remove the slide. Thank you. So what are those principles? Database decision-making, developing and maintaining the infrastructures and systems to support our efforts, but most importantly, the efforts of those on the front lines, our teachers and providers, and capacity building to ensure we have the skills and expertise needed to set and achieve high expectations. So let's look first at database decision-making, which is about what we spend, and we meaning all of us, what we spend our money on, how we spend our time, how we staff our schools and programs, who we structure services for. So how do we in RTP support database decision-making? Well, obviously, we fund 4 large data centers, and these centers help states to submit and manipulate their data. Our finance center helps states stay within the guardrails of the fiscal considerations under IDEA. A second way we really support data is our fast facts. Our fast facts are produced by RTP's data team. They portray our public data in a manner that drives stakeholders to ask questions about data anomalies, to actually use these data to drive change. Our second core principle is a focus on infrastructures and systems. It's really hard to implement an evidence-based practice in an unsupportive or chaotic system. I often hear university faculties and first-year teachers discussing the difficulties that new teachers face in implementing evidence-based practices, in implementing the evidence-based practices they were taught in their preparation programs when they work in schools that don't have systems in place to support the implementation of those evidence-based practices. I was on a panel last week and was asked, what was the best advice you could offer educators regarding children with disabilities when they return to school? I suggested that they not focus on a deficit approach, but rather maintain high expectations for children with disabilities, to focus on what they can do, not what they can't do. But those expectations need to be supported by a strong infrastructure and a strong system, and through state, district, agency, and schools that are able to support that strong support and provide that strong support. The foundation of a strong system is teacher and provider expertise. Our attract, prepare, and retain work highlighted the critical need for highly trained personnel. There is a set of leverage briefs from this work that may enhance your current efforts in this area. They can be found on the OSEP Ideas That Work website. We actually just shined up that website. I encourage you to look at the host of resources out there available on the site. Our last core principle is capacity building. We have done this through innovations, which I mentioned already, the dissemination and use of evidence-based practices, and model demonstration projects. Our models are critical because they take research-based practices and test them out in typical schools with typical teachers with typical resources, because teachers don't learn in clinically controlled environments. I always characterize our models as messy, okay? And they're messy because schools and agencies and classrooms are messy. They don't always go as expected. So these models help to predict how we can best implement evidence-based practices. So I'm going to go a little bit off script right now, talk about something I hadn't intended to talk about, but feel the need to. And just so you know, there are many people in OSEP right now pulling out their hair after I said that because they have no idea what to expect. So let me just say that yesterday you heard from Gabriella, our youth voice, about how her parents told her that if she perceived that her disability was the barrier to achieving something, rather than saying no to whatever she wanted to achieve, to say yes and then figure it out. But she never realized how hard it was to sometimes just figure it out, which is why she's pursuing a legal career and plans to help and support others to figure it out. So yesterday, I opened the Washington Post sports page. This was the headline, and I hope you can see this. It says, "A dream denied. Deaf-blind swimmer Becca Myers pulls out of the Paralympics after being told to navigate Tokyo alone with no support." Now, this is a woman who previously won 3 gold medals and a silver and holds multiple world records. She's coached by Katie Ledecky's former coach. She was told she could not have her personal care assistant with her because they were limiting support because of COVID risks. Yet the Olympic Committee has basically an unlimited number of staffers that they can bring to Tokyo. The team is supplying 1 support person for 50 athletes. This woman ended up resigning from the Olympics. She's not going to participate because of that. Now, you may not be aware of it, but 25% of our technical assistance budget goes to support deaf-blind persons. I just wanted to say that. I just wanted to say, and I'm not speaking for myself, this reflects my personal opinion. Those of you who know me know that expressing my personal opinion is pretty much consistent with how I've conducted myself throughout my career. I think that the U.S. Olympic Committee should be ashamed of themselves because what they did was shameful and reprehensible. We always say low incidence is not low priority. I only wish that Gabriella was already practicing law and kind of taking care of that business. I'm finished with my digression. I want to thank you for the incredible efforts that you've all made to change course, reallocate resources, reconceptualize what you do and how you do it. You create and deliver essential TA and support. You've done this for over 16 months. I always say that our mission in RTP is to put money in the hands of really smart people to do good things for kids with disabilities and their family, and do it in partnership with all of you, Part B SEAs, Part C Lee Agency, and Part D grantees. I believe, in spite of incredibly challenging conditions, we accomplished that mission this year. I want to thank you, and please enjoy the conference and continue to stay safe. For those of you that are Part D grantees, I taped an earlier video with some nuts and bolts and changes in the discretionary world that you're going to want to listen to. It's a real rip snorter. You can find the video in the resource section on your navigation bar. I've also been asked to remind you to please visit the input boards and add your thoughts and comments. I want to thank you again for all that you do. Thank my staff for all that they've done. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Renee Bradley to introduce our next session. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to our plenary panel this morning. I'm Renee Bradley from OSEP, and I have the pleasure of facilitating our next panel. We reached out to two longtime special educators and OSEP grantees to share some thoughts with us on returning to full in-person learning in the fall and some of the possible considerations we're all thinking about in our efforts to support states, districts, schools, communities, and families as we move forward. I'd like to welcome with us today Dr. Phil Strain from the University of Denver. He has let me know that this might be his last official presentation as he's getting ready to go off the grids in the mountains full of bears for 17 days next week. And I'd also like to welcome George Sagai, formerly at the University of Connecticut, and now Chief Gishan Tikenzo, his grandson. So welcome to both of you this morning, and I'm so glad that you took time to be with us and share your thoughts. So I'm going to start off with one or two questions, and then I'm hoping that I can just sit back and enjoy, like the rest of us, y'all's thoughts on and how we move forward. Yesterday, we heard from Deputy Secretary Cindy Martin, and she said several times, you know, how we move forward together better. And I loved that phrase. So George and Phil, and please take turns with the questions as we move forward. What have you really thought about, and what have been kind of your lessons learned observations over the last a little over a year and a half now that might inform us or be some messages as we consider what to do next for children and students with disabilities and their families, and special and general educators, since our children are general education students, children and students first?
Well, I'll go ahead and start, and I'm sure that Phil will correct me and make some comments about what I might say. First of all, I just want to acknowledge Phil because I've known him way back in the early 80s, and he's been very important in kind of mentoring my experiences over the last 40 years of my career. I always remember the first time I met him was playing Frisbee at Utah State University during a conference and having a whole lot of fun kind of learning about Phil out of the context of being the researcher and practitioner he's always been. So this is a real pleasure to be able to do this with him. And thank you, Renee, for inviting us, and OSEP and leadership for providing this opportunity for us. I've put quite a bit of thought behind where we're at right now. And I think the biggest message I want to start off with is the idea that we're in a pretty unique situation that has some pretty significant challenges for us, as well as a pretty important opportunity. The challenge, I think, briefly, is that we are experiencing something we haven't experienced before. And we have kids and families and educators and community members who are coming back from an experience that has placed significant trauma as well as stress on their experiences and how they're going to come back to school. But it's also an opportunity for us to be able to rethink how we provide an experience for kids when they come back to school. I think my biggest message is that I think we need to be strategic with the opportunity by using our minutes wisely. I think we need to be strategic by selecting the best possible interventions for which we have a long history of knowing something about. And I think we have an opportunity to be able to take care of some of the speed bumps, roadblocks, barriers that have been associated with kids with disabilities, kids with disadvantages, kids who've been disproportionately served in our school system, including kids with disabilities. So I think we have this pretty unique opportunity, but we need to be really smart and strategic about moving forward. I'll turn that over to Phil at this point, because I'm sure we'll have a chance to elaborate more on some of that. But I see it both as a plus and as a minus with respect to where we go next.
Well, thank you, George, and also let me express my thanks to Renee for this invitation. That's quite an honor, George, for me to suggest that I've been a mentor to you, my being so much younger than you. That's so unusual, but wonderful when that happens. So, you know, there's been so many things that I'm sure we've all learned from just interpersonally about how we adjust, adapt, or not to incredibly stressful situations. I can pinpoint 3 or 4 things that I think are the most salient things that I believe that I have learned that are applicable to going back to school. And the first is that in hard times, the friend that you might rely on most is science. And I'm not just speaking virology here, although that's of course included in this scenario, but I'm speaking behavioral science. And let me point out just a couple of things that we have learned that I think are directly applicable. One is that I think behavioral science has reinforced and reaffirmed the real genius of special education. And for me, that's the I in IEP or IFSP. And what I mean by that is that there's been such incredible variation in children and families' response to instruction delivered in a fundamentally different way. And a big piece of also that I in IEP or IFSP has been for me the incredible, just mind-blowing, if you will, creativity that educators and administrators have shown. There's been a lot of talk about healthcare workers, and appropriately so, as heroes. I want to add educators and put them right up there at the top of the list in terms of heroic behavior that's been on display for the last 18 plus months. The other thing that I think behavioral science has taught us that's really important is that the social and emotional fallout of COVID has been pervasive. Let me just give you a couple of data points here. About 7 out of 10 adults are now reporting, adults in the US, are reporting that the last 18 months has been the worst point in time in their life. Some of those 7 out of 10 are going to be teachers and administrators. 6 out of 10 adults report that when they go to work, they're anxious. They're anxious about their physical health and well-being still today. And some wonderful surveillance research that's been done across several thousand families of young children have demonstrated that there are persistent and palpable changes in children's behavioral development and emotional capacity related to COVID. So an increasing number of young children are experiencing sleep disturbance, increases in problem behavior, anxiety, and the like. And I think that means that a whole bunch of people, both adults and children, are going to show up in a fairly fragile capacity in going back to school. And that was one of the brilliant things that George just highlighted in his opening comments. The last thing that I want to talk about, just as a preview around this conversation, in terms of what we learned, is that I'm afraid we've also learned that the inequities that are built into service delivery and outcomes have very likely gotten worse. In spite of the best and heroic efforts of educators to have something turn out differently. And that's really an important consideration for going forward. George, I took it from your last statement that you had some other things to say about lessons learned. I really want to hear more about your thoughts on that.
I don't have a lot of lessons learned. I've got some things that I've kind of been struggling with now. One of the things you mentioned, which I think is really important for us to pay attention to, is what kids are coming to school with. However, one thing I read a couple of days ago in the New York Times is that there's a significant number of kids who are not going to come back to school, who have been out of school. And many schools and school districts are offering kids an opportunity to continue with remote learning if they choose. And the article is talking about some recent research that talks about those kids who are at home already disengaged from remote learning are probably going to opt to not go back to school either. And it was called, sort of functionally speaking, a form of dropping out, but being given permission to drop out by continuing remote learning where they weren't learning. I took that sort of set of results to kind of carry forward what you were describing as being, we've got a bunch of kids who not only are going to come to school with traumatic experiences and learning losses and so forth, we've got kids who are not going to show up at all. And many of those kids are kids with whom we work with, kids with disabilities, kids who have already experienced school to be an aversive environment already. And this gives an opportunity to not go back to that aversive environment and to be safe and sound in the quietness of their home, maybe quiet. But I think it's important for us to pay attention to what remote learning has done to the world of disabilities in the sense of who's going to come back to school, who's not going to come back, what are they going to come back with and without. Some of that's going to be good and some of that's going to be not so good. Just to kind of close that out, one thing I always like to think about is, what are we going to do about that? And I always fall back on let me just do a little side note here. In preparation for this panel to be able to do battle with you, Phil, I went back and listened to your keynote from 2016. It was phenomenal. And you taught me in that kind of 2016 keynote about how important it is to do a few things really well and to invest in the systems for long-term implementation of that evidence-based practice. One of those practices that I think is really important to us is what I like to call pre-corrections, or what Carnine and those guys call, pre-teaching. We've got a bunch of kids out there for whom we should be making contact with right now. We have families out there who we should be making contact with right now. To be able to provide a learning environment early for those kids before they even walk in the door and we have to wait for them to tell us where they're at. I liked your comment earlier in that 2016 presentation where you said, we don't need to do diagnostic testing. We just need to ask the families and parents what their experience was like, and they will tell us what to expect. And I think that's something we should be thinking about now, especially for kids with disabilities, especially kids who've experienced significant trauma with themselves or with their families, especially kids who have experienced significant political and racial violence recently. This is an off-task comment, but it goes back to your comment about personal experiences. A couple of weeks ago, I shouldn't say that, last month, I went for a cross-country trip. And my wife, for the first time, told me, I love you, gives me a hug, gives me a kiss. And then she says, be careful. And I said, you always say that. She goes, I really mean be careful. I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, you're old, you're Asian, you have an earring, and you have a ponytail. You are high risk. Nobody has ever told me that before until now. I take that and I generalize that out to kids out there now who've experienced these significant events and are in cultures and climates and communities where it's not safe. So now we're asking them to come back to school, and they're coming back to a school that's going to be very different. So how can we make that first welcoming experience positive? Well, we need to know something before they show up. every special educator who's listening right now, every personal prep person who's listening right now should be preparing themselves for early contact. And that should be a positive early contact with the idea of saying, what can we expect? And how can we address that in a positive way? So 2016, you were already saying messages that were important. And I'd encourage people who are listening now to get out there and listen to that presentation, even though it's sort of old. It's really got some important messages that relate to where we're at now.
Yeah, you know what, George, I think you really hit the nail on the head. I think the next couple of months prior to when children and families return are just fundamental to success going forward. And if you don't mind, I'd like to do a little riff on on what I think people might be spending their time doing right now. So, I mean, I think that every family ought to get, as soon as possible, as soon as this conference is over. Okay, here's your to-do list. How about the daily schedule, along with behavioral expectations of children associated with each routine that's going to be rolled out? That's going to really help. And just as an aside, regardless of theoretical orientation of professionals, nobody disagrees that maximizing predictability is step number one in trauma recovery. And that's a great first step. And George mentioned interviewing people about what their thoughts are. I would say let's survey parents and children, starting with preschoolers. Ask them about their concerns. Ask them about their expectations. Ask them about what they're excited about in coming back to school, and plan an agenda that is specifically associated with the answers you get to those things. I would also say it's time to get out your art supplies and make sure that there are visual reminders. This is especially important for young kids throughout the classroom, throughout the school, on the playground, that's associated with the behavioral expectations and the schedule that are going to be in place when kids return. My goodness, if kids don't know you, if the families don't know you, schedule a Zoom. Go visit. Make a personal, intimate contact. Write a letter to the children, to their families. I think that can be of such fundamental importance. And finally, let me just say, George said something earlier on about a unique opportunity. Let me tell you what I think the unique opportunity is, and that is that we really, for the first time, as a field, help in elevating social emotional learning to the status it deserves. And that is, in my view, a status equivalent to the investment we make in reading and writing and math and science. And I have to tell you, in all honesty, if we don't do that, I'm not sure that we are going in the short term to mitigate the negative effects of COVID. And I'm absolutely certain we're not going to protect ourselves until we do that, unless we do that for the next situation that's going to put us in a similar circumstance related to deprivations that children and their parents have experienced outside of school.
Good point. I mean, I want to build on that just for a second. I mean, I know there's a lot of conversation going on around the country around MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. And I want, you may not, but I want all special educators to know they have a role to play in MTSS. That's a leadership role. meaning we have a lot of the behavioral science figured out, if you will. We have quite a bit of knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. I love your comment that every one of us need to reach out. And I think that's true of general ed, special ed, administrators, and so forth. Administrators need to be contacting their teachers. Teachers need to be contacting family members and students. However, I'm pretty convinced that that's only a tier 1 intervention for all of us, reaching out with a handshake. And that some kids may require more than an email. Some families might need more than a voice message left on their phone or a text message. But some might require a knock on the door or an invitation to participate in something at school. And there are going to be some family members who are actually going to require something much more intense, maybe even some time with some coaching during a routine at home or whatever. But the MTSS logic has a place to play in our implementation of these evidence-based practices. I think we have special educators have the expertise on that sort of tier 2-ish, tier 3-ish practices. But those are no good if we don't create a learning environment that's caring and positive and supportive of all kids. And I think we have an obligation as special educators in particular to make sure that that's in place. Just to give you a concrete example, and I'm just kind of really hot on these 2 studies, but Clayton Cook and Paul Caldarella have done some incredible work on just basic, simple strategies, catch them at the door, as well as the use of verbal praise. And they argue that you can do so much at catching kids at the door. You can catch all 30 kids that walk in into your physics class in high school. You can catch a couple kids and give them a reminder about what's due on that day. And you can walk one kid in and help them sit down at their seat. And that's using MTSS at the classroom level. But that also is true at the family level and the kind of contacts you make. What the unique opportunity to me, expanding on your comment, is that it's about being able to do something really well. I remember a picture you showed in one of your presentations that showed the time it took to get the implementation fidelity and the time it took for that fidelity to reach maximum benefit. And you don't get maximum benefit until you reach fidelity. Well, to me, it really is about making sure we do a few things really well to fidelity and invest in that time and effort so that you can maximize the outcome for all those kids. I think it's going to be a struggle. We can't expect most kids to come to school ready to learn during this return. We're going to have to expect most kids coming back to school not ready. So that means tier 1 is about preparing kids for the not readiness that they're likely to experience. So kudos to you on that idea, because I think it's absolutely right.
And Joyce, as you were talking about those strategies from those sets of studies, it makes me think about a worry that I have had, and here it is. I'm just curious if you've shared the same one, and that is perhaps there's going to be a temptation for people to stop doing effective practices, some evidence-based practices, in the search for non-researched, non-validated COVID recovery practices. To me, if you're focusing on PBIS, if you're focusing on improving your social emotional learning, if you're focused on maximizing student engagement, you're already doing exactly what you should be doing. I'm not sure that there is a COVID recovery bullet that is to be discovered. To me, it's more about maximizing the fidelity of implementation of evidence-based practices. And if there's going to be a differentiation around supports or funding, make that towards coaching. Make sure that there are structural elements in place such that there is a higher likelihood than ever before that when kids walk into, whether it's a group of kids with identified special needs or not, there's a high probability that when children return to school, they're going to experience evidence-based practices delivered at fidelity or as close as possible, moving towards fidelity. To me, that's going to be key. I don't know. Have you worried at all, George, about people, dropping effective practices and searching for something that's going to be the 30-minute cure?
Yeah, I wish I could say I don't worry, but yes, I do worry about that. And I probably worry about it in a little bit more nuanced way, maybe. I worry about people coming back to school after this significant event, trying to do more than they should. And some of those more things are non-evidence-based practices. I had the privilege is the wrong word, but I had the opportunity to learn quite a bit about what happens after a significant event, because the PBI Center and some others were involved in supporting Parkland and Sandy Hook and some other places. And bless their hearts, there's a lot of people out there that want to help, but they help in ways that may not be productive, either asking people to do more than they should be doing, asking them to do things that are untested, asking them to do things that are evidence-based but actually not needed for that context, and so forth and so on. So I think the worry is more nuanced than giving up on evidence-based practices. It's kind of understanding the context in which people make decisions around what to do. Because like you, like I, like a lot of people, we're under a lot of stress right now. And when you're under stress, you tend to make decisions that may not be as smart or as strategic as they should be. We tend to respond more to the crisis than we do to what needs to be done. So I think you're absolutely right. We should be worried about how we make decisions about evidence-based practices. What also fascinates me about what you said is that we have places that claim to be doing evidence-based practices but aren't anyway. And so I always struggle with, how do we make sure that they let go of those things that they're not doing anyway, or may not be appropriate, or whatever, and invest in those things that are going to have the biggest impact for the amount of money that they want to invest in. I struggle with that because there's a saying that I've learned from Rob Horner, which is, if you're going to do something new and different, you got to stop doing at least two other things. And people always say, well, we don't know what to give up. I say, well, give up those things you're not doing anyway. And some of those are evidence-based practices. Now, when I think about that in a bigger sense, which is what this conference is about, when I think about our role as special educators, it's not about sort of those individual decisions per se, it's about how systems are set up to make better decisions, to help guide educators in making better choices. I think we all want to do the right thing, but like you said, we don't have the coaching. And I'll make one more last comment. And that is, to me, one of the most important coaches is that school leader, the department chair, the director of special ed, the principal, the superintendent, because they're not modeling what you're describing, Phil. If they're not helping teachers and teacher teams make decisions that are the most strategic, most effective, and so forth, we're going to be in trouble with the implementation, because as you know from the behavioral sciences, if what you do doesn't produce positive reinforcing consequences, we stop doing those things. And I think that's what a lot of us have experienced. And that's mainly because we don't have a system that gives us that internal feedback about what we should be doing. And to me, and I live with a school principal, so I sort of bias this direction, I think those people have a pretty significant role, because we can't provide coaches from the outside at the level of intensity and level of engagement that's required on a day-to-day basis. So there, Phil.
And they're back at you. Your comment about the role of leaders is so essential. I've had the good fortune over the last few years to be working with the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center out of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, as well as the National Center on Peer-Mediated Interventions, and that has given me and our team access to so many wonderful programs and systems really spread across the U.S. and I've learned so much from that implementation experience. And the primary lesson to share to reinforce your idea is, if I'm going to pick out variable number one that predicts time to get to fidelity on evidence-based practice and sustainability of evidence-based practice, it's it's the dispositions and, more importantly, the behaviors of the leader that really support that. And 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 I just want to point out another potential role for leaders in going back to school, and that is the care of the folks that they supervise. And I feel like the wellness of our workforce has never been as much under pressure as it has been. And I worry that a reasonable fraction, and understandably a reasonable fraction, of people are going to come back to work running on empty. And there's an old saying about you can't pour from an empty vessel. And I think that's absolutely the case. And so one thing that I would challenge administrators to think about is how to make work life at school a more healthy experience. Can we create the conditions, without a lot of resources, understandably? Can we create the conditions for a more healthy eating environment, for a more healthy physical activity environment, for an environment that promotes opportunities to relax, to self-manage, to meditate? Doesn't take a lot of time to do any of those things. It's mostly about embedding better behavior within existing routines. But I think that's going to be a critically important new role for administrators that I know effective people have thought about and cared about and developed policies and procedures to promote in the past. But I think not necessarily with the notion that a large fraction of folks now are going to be in need, as you've well pointed out already today, George, of differentiated support. And it's clearly not going to be a one size fits all. But I wonder if the safe assumption is everybody may need some new form of support to be effective teachers.
I can't. Oh, that's absolutely. I can't tell you how much I support that. I mean, it makes so much good sense to me. One of the people I've had recent dialogues with is Tom Bellamy, and Tom has been focusing very much on the support for administrators and superintendents on their job within these tough kind of environments. And one thing he's taught me is that these things called dispositions are important for us to pay attention to, but we somehow have to translate those into actions. Because it's easy to talk about wellness, it's easy to talk about meditation, it's easy to talk about, but if we don't clarify what those actions look like, it's going to have a hard time translating those into the environments in which we actually have to work in. And one thing I'd like to kind of expand upon and have you react to a little bit is, I'd argue that everything you said so eloquently about what administrators and teachers need to experience are the same practices that we're asking teachers to provide for their students. Provide a welcoming environment for kids is like providing a welcoming environment for educators. It's for the superintendent to provide a welcoming environment for principals, and so forth and so on. It's about acknowledging principals for doing a good job. It's about acknowledging teachers for doing a good job. It's setting routines that are predictable and positive, and so forth and so on. Through my behavioral lens, those practices are no different. What is different is the application across the different contexts and people involved. I was reading this article that was in I can't remember where it was now, and because I'm retired, I don't pay attention to references anymore, but was arguing that a change in superintendent can change a climate of a district within less than an hour of the new superintendent coming in place. And sometimes those changes are in a good direction, and many times they're in a direction that's counterproductive to what's already been successful and accomplished in that district. I can think of one district in particular where reading was highly successful. A new superintendent came in and said, well, we're going to try something innovative and new. And within an hour, teacher wellness, if you will, started to deteriorate. Student academic gains have started to decrease, and so forth and so on. School leaders at all levels, department level, program level, whatever, can have a pretty significant change in a very fragile kind of momentum that's established with effective practices. So I absolutely agree. We got to provide for all, but we need to differentiate what that all looks like. I would argue that, man, it's got to occur at really high levels for this to really have a sustainable opportunity for success, because without the acknowledgement, we're in trouble. I'd also argue over the last 6 years, we've not done a very good job at the federal and state level in promoting more positive systems for kids and educators and administrators. It's been a very hostile environment of school violence, discrimination, disproportionality, and so forth. Not that those aren't concerns we should address, but it creates this pretty negative climate. And the kids I most worry about are kids with disabilities, kids of color, kids with high risk. They're going to struggle in those kinds of environments because teachers can't provide, because their own environments are not very supportive. So I agree.
Yeah. And George, I'm so glad you mentioned Tom Bellamy. If Tom is listening, I thank you frequently for bringing me to Denver, Colorado a quarter of a century ago. Thank you, Tom. And you know, the work around disposition is an interesting one. It's a challenging one for us, isn't it, George? Given our behavioral predispositions, if you will. But there's a dispositional concept that I've been thinking about recently related to COVID. And try this one on for size. Like any new pair of shoes, it might hurt you at the beginning, but they may break in over time, who knows. But it is a disposition that might be characterized as promoting a state of grace around the COVID experience. And by that, from an operational standpoint, I mean providing a frame of reference around people's behavior that you interact with that assumes a positive intent, as opposed to willful oppositional behavior as your first interpretation of what presents itself. It also is manifest behaviorally for me in asking for and providing a safe context for people to say, I need help. And that not be the sign of a professional development weakness, but rather the opposite of insightful behavior about your own capabilities and the kind of support that you need to be effective. I also think that predisposition gets manifest in an environment that you mentioned it, George. I mean, it's irreplaceable, and the data are ubiquitous and so powerful that if you're in an environment where you hear positive things, if the feedback you get is predominantly positive, it changes everything. It changes everything. And so many people in their work life do not experience that. It's a tragedy, and especially in this context. So anyhow, that's a new pair of shoes that I invite you to try on briefly and see if they fit or not.
You know, they fit really well, and I'm going to wear those shoes and try to kick other people in the head to wake them up, because, you know, I think you're right. We've been doing some work around, I shouldn't say we, because I don't do it anymore, but there's been quite a bit of work being done around school climate. And as being sort of this damn behavior, so I've been trying really hard to operationalize what does that mean, you know? And to me, it's about arranging environments that are successful and positive. And people are going to report a positive experience or a perception about their environment if their experiences in those environments have been positive. So to me, if you want to create a positive climate, which is what you're saying, I think, you've got to overtly invest some energy into creating a positive climate for those that are moving through that environment. Because to assume it's going to change by just saying, let's be more positive, is not going to be sufficient. You know, it's about those things you mentioned earlier about creating clear expectations around what's expected. It's about creating opportunities for kids to have opportunities to respond where they experience positive success. You know, those are all concrete ways of creating experiences that are more positive, which cause people to perceive those environments as being more positive, which cause people to have relationships with others that are perceived, you know, so forth and so on. So I think, you know, in all the work that I've done, we've got those examples of how that could work. A little side note, because I don't want listeners to kind of think about what we're saying as being, you know, oh my gosh, it's going to be, we've got no hope. You know, there are lots of islands of excellence out there. And I think you and I, Phil, have benefited from those islands of excellence. Not only those that we've helped shape, those that have helped shape us as well. And I don't want us to forget about those, because I'm convinced that there are going to be places out there that are going to be very successful in helping kids return to school. I think our task, your task, because you're still working, is to document what those elements are that made those environments successful: classroom, school, family, whatever. Because, and I'm willing to bet you my wife's next month's salary that most of those practices are things that we already know, as we already talked about today, as being important to us. So, you know, the shoe fits really well for me. I don't have any trouble with them. I think the trick becomes one of how am I going to walk with those shoes to get others to be convinced to wear them at the, you know, in a way that they're going to produce the outcomes that we want. Before you respond, Phil, I just want to turn to Renee for 1 second. Do you have questions? Do you want us to talk about something else? Are you okay with what we're doing? I know you're supposed to be the moderator, but Phil's taking all the time here.
This is exactly what I wanted y'all to do. And just for those watching, I was not going to be on screen, but they were not sure they could keep themselves on track. And I'm sure you're all enjoying the conversation as much as I am. I'm looking at the time, and I would like you, I'm going to ask 2 questions. Y'all take them as you want. And we've got about 15 minutes left. One, you've both talked about MTSS as an organizing structure for practices for teachers and leaders and providers. If I'm in a school that had a great MTSS prior to March, whenever we, you know, many of us changed the way we were going to school and living, can I just pick that back up, or is it different? George, I heard you start talking a little bit about your experiences from you know, Parkland and other places in Connecticut where we had to change the way MTSS looked. So I'd be interested in y'all talking a little bit about, we can't just pick up where we were, and y'all made references to that. So how does that look? And then the last thing I'd like you to talk about is just key messages. You've said so many brilliant messages today, but if I'm sitting in this audience for this conference, you know, what are the top 2 or 3 takeaways that you would share back to people? And I'll come back on in a few minutes and unfortunately close us out.
I'll respond first to the MTSS part of it, just because that's sort of where you pointed at me when you made that comment. To me, again, MTSS is just this logic. There's no truth to what it, you know, the tiers. There's no truth to what goes inside the continuum. What to me is, it's a logic, it's a scaffolding for which we organize what we do in the context in which it's being used. I know that what tier 1, quote, tier 1 looks like, to me, it might vary based on the context. It looks different in preschool than it would in high school. It looks different than a, you know, whatever. And to me, what tier 1 is all about is what everybody experiences across all settings in that particular learning and teaching environment. It's the all question. And it goes back to one of the themes for this conference, which is equity, which means that, to me, all is about making sure everybody gets what they need to have, but everybody needs to experience what Phil was describing earlier as being the sort of positive, sort of foundational learning and teaching environment, so they can get experience what they need for their more individualized needs. I know that what tier 2 looks like for some settings might look more like what tier 1 looks like for another setting. And I know that what, you know, and so forth and so on. I want to make sure, and I've said this before, and I think people have already kind of embraced parts of it, is that special ed is not a place on that tier or that continuum. Special ed is something that's embedded throughout the continuum. You know, what I do as a special educator can be done for all kids, but it also can be done for the kids with more significant challenges and needs. What I think special ed really does is increases the accountability. It makes sure that kids get what they need to have, and it puts in place structures to maximize that accountability. Because kids with disabilities get the short end of the stick and they need to have more supports and more, you know, whatever. And that's true of kids that are not in special ed that are disadvantaged as well. So to me, it's just a set of guarantees, or at least some rules and regulations that try to maximize access and in specialized assistance. But the continuum is something that we all are members of and that we all participate in. And so I'll stop there, turn it over to Phil, because I know time's limited, and then get back to those top 3 ideas.
I really don't have much to add to the MTSS question, Renee and George, except for one brief comment, maybe 2. The first brief comment is that where the data are in place that MTSS is working, keep doing it. To the extent that your work this summer, communicating with children and communicating with their adult family members and communicating with direct providers may change the content of perhaps tier 1 and perhaps tier 2, make that change. But the brilliance of MTSS cannot be denied, especially as it pinpoints individual needs. And boy, if there's one thing, again, that we have learned about the experience of COVID and the reaction to COVID, it is highly, highly idiosyncratic. And the more our systems respond and don't see that as a negative, but as a cause for celebration on our capabilities of responding to individual needs, then that's where the gold lies. In terms of major messages going forward, let me start out with a challenging piece to you, Renee. And that is, I think the message best comes from the U.S. Department of Education and not from OSEP and OSERS, because I think the messages that I have in mind are not specific to children with developmental issues, challenging behavior, etc. So my primary messages are that getting to fidelity on evidence-based practices through providing the resources to assess fidelity and the coaching support to get there has never been more important. Let me just also say that inclusion has never been more vital than in this time of COVID recovery. Why do I say that? I say that because that provides access to typically developing children, and that provides access to arguably one, if not the most effective interventions in the social and emotional domain, and that's peer-mediated intervention. So where you have initiatives going right now in terms of maximizing inclusionary options, it's not the time to back down, it's the time to ramp up in that regard. I also think that it's never been more important for intimacy between school and families. That primarily in the service of providing continuity and predictability and comfort and security for children and youth. That seems really vital to me now. And I also say that it's never been more important for the regular educational establishment to listen to your special education colleagues. I've been thinking over the last couple of days, is return to school just one big transition issue? And we've been working on transition problems, and we know something about the data that are important to providing successful transitions. We have some powerful technologies to support the systematic movement, if you will, the more comfortable and more seamless movement of children and families from one set of environments to another. And I think that technology could well be really valuable to all of education. Those would be my primary messages that I'd think about delivering.
So I've got a couple, obviously, and I would probably just kind of spin off of what you've already commented on. I think, Phil, these might be just more refinements. And one of the big messages I would like to share is to give a homework assignment. And I would like every person who's listening right now to develop a plan for making contact with whoever they work with or for or teach or whatever. So, I was thinking as you were talking, Phil, that one thing I should be doing is making contact with my colleagues from the PBIS Center and acknowledging how they're doing, asking them how they're doing with their transition into this next step. I would love for every personnel prep director on this participating in this conference to make sure that they connect with their grantees and their schools and districts and asking, how are you doing right now in preparation for? What are you doing well? What are some things you're going to invest in? What are your concerns and so forth? I really believe that this catching early part and doing it in a positive, caring way so you can anticipate change as opposed to winging it when it shows up is going to be an important first step for us as we walk away from this conference in particular. So our homework assignment is not to think about what we're going to do on that first day, but instead, what can we do tomorrow in preparation for that first day? I also love your comment, Phil, about I had this vision in my mind of not all schools, but some schools say, okay, we're going to have 2 days of getting back to school and dealing with the recovery. And then on Wednesday, we're going to go back to where we were 18 months ago. I want us to think about, quote, this recovery as being something that's probably going to take us a long time, maybe 18, 24 months, maybe even longer for some kids as you think about the continuum. And to me, the biggest investment, as we've talked about all along, is creating this positive, caring environment for which we come back to, because the kids with the most significant needs are going to at least have to start with a positive place to work from, and then we can specialize from there. But if they come back to an environment that's more troubling, it's going to be difficult. And the last thing I'm going to just reinforce is this notion about, we got to make contact with our families, because the families are going to be making decisions and they're going to be shaping the behaviors of the kids that walk into our classrooms, be them special ed or not. I was reading an article the other day about how there are certain communities out there that are very skeptical of vaccinations. And that population of individuals who are skeptical of vaccinations are probably going to be skeptical of the safety of their children at school, and so forth and so on. I think we need to be cognizant of the kind of impact that the communities are trying to navigate, because if we don't pay attention to those, we haven't done our good functional assessment about what drives the behaviors that people are making decisions about, because we're going to be making intervention decisions that may be counterproductive to what's actually motivating some of the decisions families are making. They may not want to send their kids to school because they perceive school as being an aversive place. And so what do we do for intervention to support those families? We have kids who are going to come to school thinking it's going to be much better at school than it's going to be at home, but their parents won't allow them to go there. So, I'm making all that stuff up, but I'm willing to bet you, again, that there are examples of multiple kinds of concerns we have to pay attention to, that, as you said earlier, one size shoe, it's not going to fit all.
Thank you
How are we doing,
both.
Renee? I'm not keeping track of the time.
Yeah, I think you did great. I'm personally really grateful for you both sharing your thoughts, and I am pretty confident I can speak for many folks that are listening with us. It was knowledgeable, it was thoughtful, it was heartfelt, and I think, you know, that's where we are right now. How do we put together our head, our hand, and our heart in a way that makes sense for kids and families as we, you know, continue this adventure of, you know, like Cindy said yesterday, of getting back to a better place. And I really appreciate carving out this hour for us to all kind of stop and take a moment and think about how we put together the evidence-based practices, how we think about the structure, and most importantly, how we think about the wellness, not just of our children, but of our teachers, our providers, our leaders, and our families. I think y'all just beautifully contextualized all these little pieces that everybody's struggling to put together as we move into the next year. So thank you so much for encouraging us to maximize predictability and maximize opportunities. And I really appreciate you being with us. Thanks very much.